In the late 1960s, when I was a young doctor at the Department of Biology, way back then, the Inuits or the Eskimos were Danes, and the lead paper in our medical journal said there's an obligation for Danish doctors and scientists to look into a strange thing, namely that the Inuits or the Eskimos have a quite different pattern of mortality and morbidity of diseases, amongst which is the strange thing that they have a very low incidence of heart attacks, in spite of living from a very fat diet, seals, fatty fish, which didn't fit. At that time, we only had one known risk factor for coronary heart disease. That was a fatty diet, increasing your cholesterol and thereby increasing your risk of getting a coronary. But these Inuits, Eskimos, had a far lower incidence of coronary heart disease than the Danes living in Denmark, in spite of a fatty diet. And my chief, Dr. Bang, came to my office and said, Dr. Dyerberg, you're working on your thesis on a new methodology of determining or measuring lipoproteins, lipid fractions, in the blood. Let's go up to Greenland and see if we can solve this riddle of their low incidence of coronary heart disease despite of a fatty diet. And the three of us, Dr. Bang, myself, and a technician, went up to Greenland and examined Eskimos. And we sampled their blood, and we examined their blood for blood lipids, cholesterol, triglycerides, and so on. And we found that their blood lipid levels was favorable for a coronary heart disease point of view, but not to an extent that could explain why they had nearly 1/10 of the incidence of coronary heart disease than Americans and Danes at that time. We ended up by saying that we found some favorable thing, but we couldn't explain the big difference. So we went further into analyzing their blood. And at that time we had an old so-called gas chromatograph that enabled us to examine the fatty acids in blood. So we did the very tough job at that time. It took us nearly 2 years to measure the fatty acid composition of the blood lipids. Their blood contained 2 fatty acids that no one had paid attention to before. And I had great pains in trouble in finding out what they actually were, and I had to visit a famous lipidologist here in the US telling me that these 2 fatty acids are eicosapentaenoic acid, EPA, and docosahexaenoic acid, DHA, 2 names that now are familiar to many when they buy supplements or eat fatty fish and are told by their doctors to increase their intake of EPA and DHA. But at that time, they were 2 new names for me. I never heard them, but I came to learn them, I can tell you. Nearly at the same time, there were some new scientific inventions finding out that gave the Nobel Prize to a British doctor and 2 Swedish doctors, finding that from polyunsaturated fatty acids, your body generates some hormone-like compounds that regulates a lot of processes in your body, amongst which are the clotting of the blood. And from polyunsats that we used to take all the time at that time, and also do today, the omega-6 fatty acids, they are generated prostaglandins that enhances the blood thrombotic tendency. And we got the idea, what if these 2 new fatty acids, EPA and DHA, in our body, and we had very small amounts of that, these fatty acids in Danish blood, but they were in huge amounts in the Eskimo blood. What if these fatty acids dampened the blood clotting tendency? This could be the extra explanation we were seeking for. We concluded that if it was so, the Eskimos might have an increased bleeding tendency. And actually, when going into the literature and seeking what previous explorers of Greenland and the Arctic area said, they often wrote that when we lived for months or years on Eskimo diet provision, eating seal and fish, we got a tendency to, for example, a nosebleed. So we went up to the Eskimos again and examined, first of all, their food and found the same 2 fatty acids in very high amounts, the EPA and DHA. I can tell you that the average intake at that time among Inuits or Eskimos was more than 13 grams per day, whereas you Americans have an intake of below 200 milligrams, and nearly 25% of the American population have a zero intake. We then examined their bleeding time and found that they had a longer bleeding time. The Danes had an average cutaneous bleeding time of approximately 4 minutes, whereas the Eskimos had 8 minutes bleeding time. And that we published in the late 70s, again in the Lancet. By this publication, the omega-3 story exploded or started. So from that time on, a new facet in human nutrition was introduced to science, to nutrition, and now ends up with the present situation today where nearly everyone knows about the long-chain omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids found in marine diets.